Associate Professor Jamus.
Mr. Speaker, the Monetary Authority of Singapore Amendment Bill is complementary to the earlier Government Securities Debt Market and Investment Act, which was debated in this House late last year and on which I had previously spoken. The present bill introduces important institutional safeguards consistent with this government's overall approach of designating different accounts for distinct financial functions that are designed to inhibit the purchase of reverse management government securities, or RMGS, for the purposes of either monetizing government expenditures or financing fiscal deficits. It also embeds several related amendments to the Government Securities Act. As with the earlier legislation, the stipulations in this bill are largely technical in nature. The bill will allow the transfer of official foreign reserves, or OFRs, in excess of what is required by MAS for the conduct of monetary policy to the GIC for management. As long as we accept that the premise that such excess reserve accumulation is reasonable, then their transfer to management by GIC is likely to be sound and potentially more efficient. Mr. Speaker, I'm not opposed to this bill, but I will offer some brief comments and questions about several aspects of the bill proper, before moving on to question the premise that our present status quo for reserve accumulation is reasonable. MAS protocol currently adopts a threshold where OFRs in excess of 65% of GDP are regarded as excessive. Understand that this threshold is not established in law and is operationally determined. Yet Clause 15A indicates a capped aggregate amount of 580 billion, which, by Article 144A of the Constitution, requires a parliamentary resolution to overturn. I'm not opposed to this, of course, but I'm left wondering why such a specific limit would need to be hard-coded into the letter of the law, since the functional use of RMGS purchases are, in any case, limited to reserve management purposes rather than fiscal expenditure. One is also left to wonder how the 65%, or for that matter, the 580 billion threshold was determined. Would these two amounts be consistent at all times? After all, a 65% of GDP will continue to increase in absolute terms as the economy continues to grow, whereas the dollar amount would not. Would this mean a need for periodic revisions to the 580 billion? I would also add that since 2010, Singapore has been party to the Chiang Mai Initiative, while the Federal Reserve has also extended temporary dollar financial swap facilities to Singapore since the global financial crisis in 2008. Does the threshold already account for the additional extra liquidity available as a result of these swap arrangements? Now, conversely, the abundant liquidity conditions currently in place resulting from large-scale asset purchases due to unconventional monetary policy operations such as quantitative easing appear globally to be steadily receding. The Fed has already announced tapering operations, and many central banks have already begun the process of low interest rate normalization. And markets already anticipate tighter liquidity conditions to set in around the middle of this year. Would the threshold be sufficient if we are no longer living in a world of abundant liquidity? Sir, the meta question that this bill poses, however, should also, in my view, be asked. Why are our foreign exchange rate reserves accumulating as rapidly as they are? The official reason furnished by MAS in its explanatory brief accompanying this bill is that appreciation pressure on the Singapore dollar is the result of, and I quote, positive net saving and persistent capital inflows arising from abundant liquidity in global financial markets. End quote. But this only begs the question of why we appear to be resisting such appreciation pressure, of which excess accumulation is but the consequence. The standard explanation that MAS is mandated is that MES is mandated to pursue an exchange rate policy aimed at mitigating the effects of excessive short-term volatility in the real economy. By minimizing short-term volatility does not by any means preclude a steady appreciation, or depreciation for that matter, over time. Mr. Speaker, emerging economies in the process of development exhibit exchange rates which, after correcting for inflation, tend to appreciate over time. This is especially the case for countries that have experienced rapid economic growth, as Singapore has since independence. Yet, remarkably, our real effective exchange rate, that is the average rate relative to our major trading partners, while waxing and waning over the decades, has remained remarkably close to the level that prevailed in 1970. While we were still a middle-income country, this may have been a viable development strategy. However, inasmuch as we remain an open economy reliant on competitive exports, we must not forget that there is also a flip side to such exchange rate undervaluation. Not only does this drive up the cost of the intermediate goods our manufacturers use as inputs to production, it also indirectly impoverishes our consumers, who must now face higher prices for the Nike shoes, Samsung TVs, and Apple iPhones that we import from elsewhere. This is all the more so in the current macroeconomic environment. Singapore's headline inflation rate, as we discussed earlier on during question time, touched 3.8% in November, the highest in more than 8 years. And now this should be unsurprising given how much of our goods and services are, in fact, imported. And as Minister of State Loh, as well as Minister Indrani mentioned, global inflation is likely to remain elevated due to a mix of supply constraints, tight labor markets in certain segments, and heightened fuel prices. Indeed, both the MES and MTI have themselves acknowledged that this state of affairs is, and I quote, likely to continue in the near term, end quote. I'm not, of course, the first to suggest that our real exchange rate may in fact be undervalued. In 2019, the US Treasury first placed Singapore on a watch list for currency manipulators, a position that it maintained in its latest iteration, released in April last year. Other observers, using more rigorous assessment criteria, have posited the same thing. I would at the very least urge additional introspection and research by MES on whether there is, in fact, a potential undervaluation of the Singapore dollar, and to publish and share with the public the results of such research. If so, perhaps the government will consider whether a true gradual appreciation of the Singapore dollar, which would in turn indirectly mitigate much of the excess OFR problem that is a major motivation behind this bill, might eventually be warranted, especially for an economy at our current stage of development.